In today's gospel reading, there is a lot going on. A lot happens in today's gospel reading. And ultimately, the blind man receives his sight. And there's a fairly lengthy interaction between the blind man and the Pharisees, and an interaction between the blind man and Christ on several different occasions. And so this morning, by the measure of grace granted to us, we're going to look at the Pharisees and the blind man, and how the Pharisees, on the one hand, behaved and thought during the interaction in today's gospel reading, versus how the blind man was during the various interactions told to us in today's gospel reading. And so we're going to look at the Pharisees just throughout the reading. And in verse 22, we read, "For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue." A couple verses later, as the Pharisees are talking to the blind man, we read, "So they again called the man who was blind and said to him, 'Give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner.'" In verse 29, the Pharisees again speaking say, "We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from." And then towards the end of the gospel in verse 34, again, the Pharisees speaking to the blind man say, "You were completely born in sins, and are you teaching us?" Let's look at some of the things the blind man said during today's gospel. So towards the beginning of the gospel in verse 7, we read, "So he went and washed and came back seeing." So this is after Christ spits in the soil and makes clay and anoints his eyes and tells him to go and wash. And so he went. Jesus Christ, he didn't know he was God yet, told him to go and wash, so he went and washed. In verse 11, he was answering the Pharisees, and we read, "He answered and said, 'A man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to the pool of Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and I received my sight.'" In verse 25, again in his dialogue with the Pharisees, he says, "Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know." And in verse 36, towards the end of the gospel, when he's speaking to Christ once again, he says, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And so there's a big contrast in how the Pharisees approach the happenings of today's gospel versus how the blind man approached. The Pharisees, they know everything, right? The Pharisees had already agreed. The Pharisees said, "Give God the glory, for we know that this man is a sinner." The Pharisees said, "You were completely born in sin, and now you're trying to teach us." The Pharisees, in the interaction in today's gospel, come from a position of, we already know. We know the facts. And we're telling you, we're making statements. Versus the blind man. So he went. He was told to go, so he went and washed. When he was asked how he was given his sight, he said, "A man called Jesus made clay, anointed my eyes, and told me to wash, so I went and washed." He didn't actually know how he got his sight back. He knew what happened. He knew that Jesus did some things, and he told me to go wash, and I went and I washed, and I got my sight. It's not really an explanation of how. It's an explanation of the events, but not the how. But very simply, he was obedient. Whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know, right? When he's responding to the Pharisees, I do not know. Who is he, Lord, that I may believe, right? It is an orientation of recognizing I don't know, and wanting to know, and being willing to be led to that knowledge. So there's a huge difference in how right? The two groups, the Pharisees on the one hand and the man born blind on the other, approach this great miracle that we read about today. And St. Paul sums maybe this distinction up really well in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, when he says, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." For we walk by faith, not by sight. And how can we walk by faith, all of us today, walk by faith, not by sight? How can we approach our personal walk with Christ like the man born blind and not like the Pharisees? And we're going to look at one very small piece that we're given today in the Catholic epistle on how we can practice walking by faith, not by sight. How we could be like the man born blind and accept the grace of Christ and his Godhead, and not be like the Pharisees who, though are completely incorrect, think they know everything. And in the first verse of today's Catholic epistle, St. John tells us, "If we receive the witness of men, the witness of God is greater." If we receive the witness of men, the witness of God is greater. And we receive the witness of men all the time. All the time we receive the witness of men. Gladly we receive the witness of men. And the witness of men has proved over and over and over to oftentimes be exceedingly fallible, to be completely incorrect. And we'll look at a couple examples of things that weren't just like the mistake of an individual or a person, but things that, and we'll look at science, right? Something factual, things that were accepted as facts, and if you disagreed with those, you were considered crazy because they were facts, and how can you disagree with facts? So once upon a time, science, right, and this was, you guys, these aren't like fringe beliefs, this was the consensus of mankind at the time. We believed in spontaneous generation. We believed that living things could generate from not living things. And it wasn't until someone did an experiment with some meat and a jar and some film, and science said, oh, okay, maggots didn't come out of this dead piece of flesh. There was actually something else that happened. But for a very long time, this concept of spontaneous generation, which to us now sounds insane, was factual. Factual, right? It was a fact. For a very, very long time, there's the belief in the classic elements, that all matter was composed from a combination of 4 basic elements, which were air, earth, fire, and water. And this was believed before Aristotle. Aristotle believed this, right? And he lived around 300 BC. This wasn't finally refuted until 1789. So for almost 2,000 years, it was a fact, it was a scientific fact, according to the witness of men, according to science, that everything was made of these 4 elements. For a very long time, mankind believed that the earth was in the middle of the universe. This was a belief that predated Aristotle, and it wasn't disproven until Galileo came along in 1610. So again, for almost 2,000 years, it was a fact that Earth was in the middle of the universe, and everything rotated around the Earth. For a very long time, the scientific and the medical belief around the human body was that it was composed of 4 substances: blood, yellow bile, phlegm, and black bile, and that the health of the human body revolved around the balance of these 4 substances. The fact that germs exist, which is something we know now, was considered insane until the middle of the 19th century. And when I say it's considered insane, literally, there was a man named Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis, who was somewhere in the Baltic area in Europe, and he perceived that there was a very high maternal mortality rate in the ward of the hospital he worked in, and he suggested that doctors, before they deliver a baby, would scrub their hands in a chlorinated lime solution. And when they did this, the mortality rate in the ward he worked at fell from like 18% to 2%. And so he published his findings. And he was then admitted into a mental asylum by his peers. The doctors were very offended as a publication, and he was actually admitted by his colleagues into a mental ward where he died because what he was saying was so preposterous. And so all of these things were facts. These were all things that were accepted by society, right, according to the witness of men. And you might think, well, okay, those are all crazy things. We've never believed any of those things because we know better. But we also value the witness of men so much, right? And we accept the witness of men in our day-to-day, in our education, in our life. Who here has personally confirmed that the Boston Massacre occurred? Or did we just read about it in a textbook? You've confirmed that it occurred. Read it in a textbook. Have our teachers confirmed that it occurred? Or did they also receive it? Was anyone alive that has taught us about the Boston Massacre or the Tea Party? How about the fact that 99.99999, I don't know how many nines there are at the end of this, of matter is empty space? That's what we believe. That's what we believe according to, atoms and all that stuff. 99.99% of matter doesn't feel empty, but this is mostly empty space. It's mostly the electron cloud around the nucleus of an atom. And that sounds absolutely preposterous, but every single one of us believes it, right? That atomic science is good science, and someone did something to prove it. I have no clue what they did or how they figured that out, but I believe them, and we all believe them. Because a man told us, right, a human being told us that that is a fact. And they told us that they did some science to prove it. Even though on its face that's preposterous. So how much more if we accept the witness of man so readily when we know it has been wrong over and over and over and over again, and when it's telling us things that defy logic, but we believe it, how much more should we accept the witness of God, which is far, far greater than the witness of men? How about when God tells us something that makes absolutely no sense to us? How about when God instructs us to live contrary to how men tell us to live? How about when we receive instruction from our fathers of confession, our spiritual fathers, our spiritual mothers, that is beyond our understanding? What if you were told to water a stick, a dead stick, for years on end? Who would continue? Do we accept the witness of God the same way we accept the witness of men? Will we, each of us, accept the witness of God and permit our spiritual eyes to be opened? That is the miracle that we read about today. Yes, the blind man's fleshly eyes were opened, but the true miracle and what the opening of the eyes of the flesh points to is the opening of the eyes of his soul. At the end of the gospel, he recognizes Christ as God. The eyes of his soul were opened. He recognized God not with the eyes of the flesh, because the Pharisees also had those, but with the eyes of the soul. That is the true miracle that we read about today. And if we accept the witness of God, dare I say, even to the same degree we accept the witness of men, though we should accept it much more willingly and with much more confidence, then we will be taking a step in what Paul describes as living by faith, not by sight. May God grant unto us the opening of the eyes of our souls. All glory be to God forever. Amen.
Blessed are they